Okay, this is a talk on democratizing public policy debates, experts, media, and public involvement in the discourse of the economy. It was prepared for an AltAusterity Conference in 2020, whose theme was rebuilding the public purpose, and was held in McMasters University in Hamilton in Canada. It's put together by myself, Brendan O'Rourke, John Hogan and Joseph Fitzgerald, all of whom work at Technological University Dublin. Just to outline this short presentation, I want to really drive home the point that public purpose is required for a decent public discourse, and that actually the current models of the economy, such as neoliberalism, do not really meet this essential feature for public discourse today. I'll then talk about ways that we could grow public purpose in the discourses in the economy, before saying that perhaps a focus on budgetary processes would be useful, and then I'll make some conclusions. At the end of the slide are a list of references and resources, some of which I've relied on in my arguments in this presentation. The real thing that is a problem in modern society, and the reason we so desperately need the return of a strong public purpose, is to do with something that's been going on in society for a couple of hundred years, and that is specialization. Increasingly, as capitalism advances and we get better off, there's increased specialization. Now, to some extent, the market provides a solution and has provided a reasonably good solution to this. So it's said, for instance, that none of us, because we're so specialized, know how to make a pen anymore from start to finish. No one person does that, because even the production of such a simple item involves many specializations. So none of us can do it from scratch anymore. But the market can deal with some specialization arising from things like pens, because although there's a great diversity of pens to choose from, it's pretty easy for us as individuals, different individuals, to assess which pen suits us. We can easily assess the outputs of specialization. However, what's becoming increasingly a problem, and the market can't cope with, is the situation that arises when we go, for instance, to choose which word processor we're going to use in order to write. Because really, none of us are equipped to know what the best word processor is. There's a lot of choice, there's a lot of features, from Microsoft Word to the free LibreOffice, and choosing among those, we certainly can't individually produce them, and most of us who aren't specialists in that area don't really know how to pick the best word processor for ourselves. And this means that we need to rely on the assessments of other people, and that's what we call hyperspecialization, a situation where we can't even see how to choose which output from specialization without reliance on somebody else's assessment, expert assessment of what's best. So public purpose is required for public discourse. Increasingly, hyperspecialization means a dependence on others' assessments, making us more dependent on expert discourse, which we need to trust. And this is particularly acute in a society like Ireland, where we're dominated by foreign direct investment companies, and we're so tied into the hyper-specialization that's distributed across the supply chains of the world. And that means we can't judge outputs independently. Attempts to measure what's best through markets, our quasi-markets where we have certain output measures, can't resolve our dependence problem, as they depend on easily accessible performance measures. And I think Milgram's book, The Great Endarkenment, make this point much more strongly than I have had time to make it here. But this dependence on other people's assessment has increased the trust we need to put in experts or specialists, of all sorts. And that trust requires a benevolence beyond the individual, which neoliberal solutions and market solutions cannot easily provide. Benevolence, which is an essential part of trusting somebody else, requires that you have a sense of common or public purpose with that other person. So hyper-specialization in public policy, for instance, means that we have increased technocratization, indeed, particularly in public policy and public service and media discussion of public policy. We've an increased dependence on economists. And there's a lot of good research showing that. And indeed, research by one of the authors of this slideshow, Joe Fitzgerald, and myself, have shown what a particularly good crisis economists have in terms of increasing their institutional power. So that dependence on experts is increasing. Everywhere, hyperspecialization undermines administration as separate from policy, rules as separate from administration. That is so separate to the neoliberal ideal state. So I think in simpler times, we had this idea that we could lay down rules, that we could simply order specialists to operate, and specialists would have to just do as they were told, and we could rely then on the politicians and lawmakers to define what was done. But these days, actually, it's much more complex than that. The public service servant administrating a scheme is somebody who has enormous knowledge that is not possessed by the head of department, and therefore they need to be trusted in their assessment of what is best to do. Unsurprisingly, measures of trust like the Edelman survey have shown that there is increasing distrust. This is driven by increasing inequality. And the people who suffer most from lack of trust tend to be those with lower incomes. So this issue of trust, I suppose, is particularly concerned to people at this conference because it particularly hits hard those who are suffering most from inequality. Marketized media cannot solve hyperspecialization problems. Marketized media is essentially becoming more specialized and hyper-specialized and splinters itself. This is not helped by media manipulations, both commercially and politically motivated ones, and that's driven down trust in old and new media. The Edelman survey, for instance, shows that Ireland suffers particularly from a lack of trust in media, at a mere 37% trusting the media compared to 53% in Canada. So we need new mechanisms to provide a public sphere for policy discourses involving new organizations, public service culture, and media institutions with a sense of public purpose. So now we know that a major cause of the lack of public discourse is hyperspecialization, and the hyperspecialization, in order to overcome it, can't be overcome by relying on the selfishness of others, but requires some sense of public purpose. How can we help grow that sense of public purpose? I think we can, and I think there's particular optimism in the area of trying to grow public discourse in discourses on the economy. So I suppose economics, much of it, of the discourse of economics, is neoliberalized and driven by ideological concerns. But even within mainstream economics, there has been some growth from the disasters of the mainstream economics attitudes to the crisis that was seen before the outbreak of the crisis. So the winners of the Nobel Prize in Economics this year, two of them have written a book which is quite radical in many ways, even though they're still part of mainstream economics. And we've also seen an economic student movement, and we've seen some pressure for business schools to reform the way they teach and talk about the economy. I also think that even within mainstream economics, one of the things that attracts so many good and bright students to the topic is the trope of efficiency, which is the mainstream of economics. Now, there's lots of problems with the focus of economics on efficiency, and its willful ignorance of the distributional matters and who benefits and who gains, and its focus on efficiency have done lots of harm. But I think the appeal of the idea of efficiency has been that sense of a public purpose. Now, I think it's a very thin and problematic sense of public purpose, but I think it shows just how hungry people are to have it, that they've accepted the rather impoverished view of the public purpose at the center of economics. Now, the great thing, of course, is that since, particularly since the crisis, but also before, projects like our own, AltAusterity, has provided lots of resources for public purpose discussion on the economy. And we've done a lot of thinking about this, particularly since the 2008 crisis. So we've done a lot of work on this issue, which remains central to what's going on in public discourse, and remains central to trying to get a sense of public purpose once more. I suppose trying to capture, where some of this could go would be that I think, we could look in a homely sort of metaphor about the value of growing a public purpose, particularly in public discourse on the economy. And I think you could view the kind of plant and the fruit of the plant as policy outcomes. And clearly, since 2008, many countries, including Ireland, haven't had a massive change in policy outcomes. There's certainly been some, but the neoliberal framing of the policies seems to continue. But I'm not saying we should give up on that, but I am saying the fruit from kind of alternatives to austerity, alternatives to neoliberalism that has been discussed, hasn't really come true yet. But I think we've got to see that as growing out of, if you like, a substrata of public and media discourses and academics and think tanks, many of which we've studied as part of the AltAusterity Partnership Development Grant. So we've got a lot of knowledge about that. And we've seen that beneath those are trends of technocratization of the public discourse, and the idea of constitutionalizations are, embedding economic policy in hard to change rules that Stephen McBride has studied so much. And of course, beneath those, we've seen the very hardened issues of particular institutions favoring austerity, and of course the interests of the top 1% favoring austerity as well. But I think if we can concentrate at least on that middle layer where we're already making progress, we might be able to grow a sense of public purpose to solve some of society's problems in this area. I'd go further and say not only can we rediscover the necessary sense of public purpose that is needed so much in this age of hyperspecialization, but actually we could focus particularly on budgetary processes. So now we studied in this project budgetary processes, and I suppose what's amazing is how much these have been coordinated internationally. And if you like, neoliberalism as part of the technology of austerity has installed these processes all over the Western world, from Canada to the UK to the EU to the USA. And obviously that in a way has been very damaging, because it's enforced, particularly in Europe, the idea of austerity and the idea of neoliberal as the solutions that, as we know, don't work. However, in building those processes, I do think we now have a common way across quite a vast geographic area of discussing public policy. And in a way, we can use these well-known processes to help engage the public in public policy debates. And even neoliberals, and I have a picture here of my neighbour, Finance Minister Donoghue, who's in the caretaker government at the moment, who's a very nice, gentle face of neoliberalism. Horrific, though I think the policies of the government have been when it comes to things like housing and health. But you've got to acknowledge that people like Pascal O'Donoghue or other neoliberals do acknowledge the need for public legitimization. So in some ways, that provides a common and predictable focus for us to, if you like, grow that sense of public purpose around budgetary processes. And again, we have lots of experience on this project, focusing on public purposes in budgetary processes, and also on the role of think tanks, particularly neoliberal think tanks, that Dieter Pluet has done a lot of work on, that tells us about what is happening within this budgetary process. So there's a lot of knowledge here, a lot of learning that can be used to build public purpose. The focus on budget processes too, I think, is something that interests the media a lot, and therefore it's publicly discussed, and it also allows us to, I suppose, enter into the argument about what public service media should be about. I mean, clearly the models of public service media are beginning to run into problems all around. Certainly reform of the state broadcaster, the public broadcaster in Ireland, RTE, is now open for debate, as is the BBC in the UK. And I think many of us are anxious that those organisations be reformed, but not in a way that merely commercialise them. So I think we could probably do a lot of research on finding new models of organisation for public service media based on public purpose that really gives those most lacking in the ability to trust information sources a greater reason to believe those media outlets. The other thing that might be done in budgetary process is to involve and use mini publics in the way that constitutional changes were discussed, for instance, in Ireland. Now there's been some experimentation of this with local budgets in Ireland, but I think that's something else we could look at to build a public purpose conversation about economic policies. So I suppose I'd conclude with saying, we've been growing public purpose and we can keep on doing that, even if the garden in which we grow it has largely been designed by neoliberalism or the dominance of neoliberalism since the 1980s. And this is not only an answer to the problem of austerity and neoliberalism itself, but I think it also is an answer to the crisis of democracy that occurs in hyperspecialization. So I think if we can focus on building the public purpose and that idea, which has been, identified by the leaders of this project, I think that could really help develop, transparency and benevolent representation and deliberation. And, as I suggested, focusing on budgets might leverage as our resources for that. So thanks a million for listening to me. And I've talked a lot in the first person, but I would like to acknowledge my co-authors, again, Joe Fitzgerald and John Hogan, both again at TU Dublin. Thanks very much.